So yeah, welcome everyone. Thanks for your patience. So this is a Culture, Mind, and Brain seminar series, which is usually more regular, but lately has been a bit slower. But we try to focus on different interdisciplinary issues at the intersection of culture, mind, and brain. And today we're very excited to have Professor Lan Li, who is joining us from Johns Hopkins, and I think really works in a very similar ethos to what we try to do here. So Lan did their PhD at MIT in anthropology, history, and social science studies.
Watching him be like, oh, yeah, that is, yeah.
Yeah, that's what you did. And then did, I guess, postdoctoral work, right, at Columbia on the intersection of neuroscience and society. And now works as an assistant professor in the history of medicine department at Johns Hopkins. And so actually Lan and I and Nathan, who's here today, met about a year and a half ago at this strange workshop that we were all invited to, where it's basically some people a collection of donors who are trying to launch the field of the scientific study of subtle energy. And so they're very interested in different ways that we can kind of study how energy courses through our body, how energy can be healing. And this is where we met. And I was really just immediately struck by Lan as soon as they started speaking, that they have a very kind of intricate cultural, historical take on how to map these kind of complicated phenomenological experiences and the potentially underlying neurobiological correlates, but then really thinking from the perspective of a kind of cultural history of how do we actually even get the maps that we have of how we think about the subtle body. And so actually Lan's about to release their first book, which is all about the history of subtle body maps in the Chinese medical tradition and kind of the way that it's evolved as a global tradition around the world. And so that's coming out next month, right? And so I think we're going to get a kind of preview of some of what Lan described to me as a footnote in that book.
Yeah, the talk is a footnote.
Yeah. So, yes.
Cool.
All right.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you.
Hi, everyone. Part of this talk is going to be interactive. So if you want to sit closer to the table or not, we'll figure it out. I invite you in. And I can walk around. I don't have to walk around. I know I probably shouldn't if there are people on Zoom. But yeah, I'm Lan, and I just flew in this morning, so I've been awake for a very long time. But thank you, Michael, for hosting me, and I'm actually really excited to be here. And yeah, please, if you can't hear me on Zoom, just unmute and tell me. So usually I say that I work on invisible anatomy. My background is in history, anthropology, and science studies. I also work as a filmmaker, a media producer. But broadly, this project is really about measurement and math and meridians in global Chinese medicine. And I'll say a little bit more about what that all means. But it's kind of a paradox where any form of anatomy needs images to be rendered visible. So someone arguing over a pancreas and a spleen, those are arguments over ontology and ontology through images. So I'm not saying that this is unique, but it is also kind of unique. And I'll say a little bit more about why. And the book that's coming out on April 15th next month is called Body Maps: Improvising Meridians and Nerves in Global Chinese Medicine. And this book is really about, it's kind of a comparative history without being comparative, without using the terms East and West. It looks more at what these images can tell us at a much more nuanced reading of this 10th century history. And I framed this book, the fonts are a bit off, but it's fine. So I framed the book through what I describe as technologies of life. It's part of a bigger project that I work on. And just to give you a sense of how I'm sorting through these definitions, I think about technologies of life through a long history of hand-drawn images. So these images, these structures are only ever rendered by hand. not through MRIs, not through CT scans, not through X-rays. They're only ever hand-drawn, wood blocks, etchings, etc. And they're old technologies that are representing, again, invisible anatomy. And we can say more about what invisibility means. And these technical images also had really practical implications for what the body could do and what it did do through units of life. So everything that you see on the table will add up to a single unit of life and are composed of units of life that I'll say more throughout the next 40 minutes or so. But it's also important for me to create a relationship with what I mean by technology. So with technologies, a lot of scholars tend to turn to Marcel Mauss, French sociologist who's writing from the early 20th century to the mid 20th century. And he's known for writing essays, really thinking about techniques as a way to save humanity, because he's looking at all these wars. And so he describes technology as a study of techniques. And of course, this is in the Francophone tradition. And techniques are traditional efficient acts. And most, again, he's looking at technology as a verb, as an action. One of his contemporaries, Lewis Mumford, who's in the US, also a sociologist, he's looking at techniques in civilization, techniques as objects and practices of civilization and for civilization. So they're thinking about humanity at a much larger scale. And of course, later on, Heidegger builds on this in the mid 20th century, where he thinks of technology as human contrivances that moves us towards modernity, even though these scholars might disagree on what counts as modernity. But fundamentally, in terms of what all of the scholarship is meant to do for someone like Mauss, is that there shouldn't be a distinction between the human and the technical. They should be one thing. And that's what allows people like Foucault to write about techniques of self. And Foucault, of course, writes about techniques of science systems, techniques of power, techniques of production. But there's still a tension where, even though the human and the technical should be one thing, among all of this literature, there's still a separation. And there's a separation between the human dimension and its technical creations. And this is important for someone like me working in Asia, and especially East Asian anatomy, because a lot of the people and the scholars and the sources that I work with, they'll tell you that the body is a technology. But what does that mean when they're completely being framed by this scholarship? This scholarship that, even though it's meant to join the human and the technical, also implicitly ends up splitting the two, because this literature, this historiography, is fixated on civilization, capital, war, modernity, industry, and efficiency. And so for someone like me, where I'm looking at sources from the first century, and the sources from the first century reference even earlier sources, what does it mean for me to maybe think about theorizing East Asian sources through East Asian sources, rather than theorizing it through Anglophone and Francophone, Germanphone scholarship, even though this is really important and it is very relevant. So just to simplify, what about histories of technology without efficiency? Is there a way to write about this body, this technology that emerges before a language of industry, a language of efficiency and modernity? So can we think about histories without, of technology without efficiency? So I was thinking about this, and I'm working on an article version of this part of my work. And I'm looking more specifically, if I want to think to go back further in time, I'm thinking about starting in around the 5th century BCE, 5th, 4th century BCE. So this is the time of Confucius. This is the time a little bit after Lao Tzu, after the Tao Te Ching is written. And there's a really old story that comes from this period about technology. And it's a story about a scholar and a farmer. So the story goes, again, from this period, the story goes that once upon a time, there's a scholar who is a student of Confucius. He had his fun. He's traveling between the kingdoms. It's the Warring States period, and he's traveling between kingdoms. He's on vacation. He saw some friends, and on his way home, he sees a farmer, and he sees a farmer struggling to water his plants with something called a wump. It's a ceramic container that I think is more for storage than for distributing water, but he's carrying the wump from the well to his crops, and he's not being very efficient. And the scholar tells the farmer, you know, I know of a wooden device that can pump water from the well, and you can water hundreds of crops. It's great. And the farmer responds like either flushing with anger or flushing. He's either laughing or he's upset, because he says, where there is a cunning device, there is cunning action. And where there's cunning action, there's a cunning mind. And he adds to say that this is his master is telling him that a cunning mind is not equipped for clarity. This lack of clarity agitates the spirit of life, and an agitated spirit of life cannot contain the Tao. So we might think, well, this is maybe not really a farmer. Maybe he's a part-time farmer, and he's really spending a lot of his time cultivating a spirit of life through carrying the wong, the water in the wong. But he adds and he says, I know of this device and I'm ashamed to use it. What's really interesting is that for some contemporary readers, they might read this as a refusal for technology. But what I'm interested in is this culture of refusal. What does it mean to refuse? Because he's refusing to use this wooden device, which he already knows about. If this event was happening in Southwest China, there are lots of rivers, irrigation is a really sophisticated system. And so people know about these water pumping systems. And he's refusing this so that he's refusing a cunning mind so that it will not dictate his gestures, and it will not prevent his way of cultivating and containing the Tao. So I was interested in this story because of the story itself, and maybe the moral is to not be too clever. I don't know. And there's other literature that I situate this in. Some scholars working on Asia are trying to situate modernity not through industry. Some historians like Alexander Woodside has written about lost modernities, which focuses on meritocracy and the use of the civil service exam. But other scholars like Dorothy Coe is like, you can't have an elite class with a meritocracy if you don't have craftspeople making the seals, creating the inkstones. So you can't have an elite class to define modernity without thinking about class in general. And of course, there are other historians of technology. David Edgerton is a very famous one to think about shock of the old, where small technologies, everyday technologies should be drawing our attention rather than these big narratives of innovation. So this story fits in that. It's an everyday story. But another reason why I was interested in this story is because of the term that I've translated as cunning device. And this word cunning, I mean, for those who recognize these characters, there are other ways I'm thinking about this translation, that cunning could also in context mean clever, convenient, busy, active, mechanical, operational, disengaged, unfocused, unstable. Meanwhile, this other word for device could maybe be technique-ish. But these two words, either 机械 in Mandarin, Gehai in Cantonese, which is a much older dialect, these two words are interesting because they're inherently material. So they come with a wood radical, and it's not brass, it's not gold, it's wood, maybe because of the malleability of wood, maybe because of the kinds of devices that are made with wood, like looms, for instance. And there might be clues to this word because it comes from a very old story. There might be clues in what this might mean through the script style. So this script style, what you see right here, is kaishu, which gets stabilized around the 7th and 10th century. But the story that I just told you is from the 5th century BCE, 4th century BCE. And the script style in that period, if you go further in time, looks more like this, 篆书, carved in stone rather than inscribed on paper with a brush. So cunning looks like this, and this is the word for device, which I found really, really, really interesting. So if you look more closely at it, wood now looks like this, but this side of the character is fascinating because on the bottom you have hands reaching up to something that may be a weapon, but also maybe a bigger device like a loom. And if you reconfigure this word and you change this to the kaishu, this changes to hand, a different version of hand. This is the word for self. So if you say, like, if anybody takes a first-year Mandarin class, they'll say, like, me, I want this, I want that. Well, y'all, like, this is the term for self, which means that here you have a self that is already action, a self where technology and technique are already, there's no divide between the two. And it's a relational and objectified thing. And you can aspire to contain the Tao, or you can use it to avoid a cunning device. So this is just things that I'm thinking with when I try to imagine a history, an old history of technology that doesn't focus on efficiency, but might bring us to a different starting place. And I know that there are some early modern historians of science who also think about self in these non-dualistic ways, but I'm trying to see if there's another starting point for us in the sources through a reading of these earlier texts. So we can say maybe technology is a study of techniques. Techniques are cultivation of the self, and self includes or involves acts of moderation, that together maybe technology studies techniques of self. And this is just me thinking through methodologically through this kind of philological and etymological way of thinking about self without separating the human domain from its technical creations, because the hand is an extension of the body, just like anything else. You'll see soon that these meridians also extend from the body. They break the boundary of what we might think of as a corporeal body, but they are also corporeal objects. In terms of periodization, I don't usually say that I work on Chinese medicine. This idea or this category of traditional Chinese medicine is invented in the mid-20th century as a national project. We have Tibetan medicine, Korean medicine, Vietnamese medicine, and there are also terms for national medicine and local medicine. So I think I'm thinking about trying to reframe my periodization through the literature that surrounds Edward Said's 1978 book, Orientalism. But scholars who build on Orientalism also think about what we do after the publication of this book, so after Orientalism. So Said, who was a Palestinian literary critic, he's not a historian, but he writes historically. And his observations is mostly made through travel writing. And even though he's not a historian, his observations are provocative, and there is some truth to them in the sense that he describes that the relationship between the Occident and the Orient is a relationship of power, domination, and varying degrees of a complex hegemony. So power is part of a complex hegemony. But of course, he's writing about this in a way that disrupts the historiography, because there are a lot of Orientalists, British Orientalists, for instance, who invest a lot in learning and reading Sanskrit. But historiographically, he's disrupting it by reorienting the field of Orientalism in this way. And it's important that this happened during the Cold War. It's important that for someone like Said, he's writing about the East, really focusing on the Ottoman Empire, where the East is so close to the West, it's really your neighbor. And it's given rise to literature focusing on difference, scholars working on post-colonialism, and it's given rise to subaltern studies. And of course, scholars who think about nationalism have to think about it alongside Orientalism if they're working on Asia, and in discourses of modernity. But I'm also thinking about the hybridity, maybe the co-construction of Orientalism, where people who are in the Orient are also contributing to the fantasies of the Orient. But at the end of the day, this is about the politics of representation, which is something I'm really interested in, because I mentioned that I also make films about Asian medicine. I worked with practitioners. I grew up with parents who were musicians. My grandfather was an artist. Some of the early artwork you saw is from our private collection of paintings. But I think about representation in this way because it's important it has important implications on materiality of the practice, and also the materiality of the body. So again, I'm thinking about after Orientalism also through scholars like Ali Behdad, who is also a literary critic, and he writes about people who are both appropriating and using Oriental genres in the Middle East. So he thinks about Orientalism in photography, and he tends to think about Orientalism as an invitation to undertake what he describes as an open-ended mode of criticism, to challenge the regime of truth that has produced and sustained binaries, these binaries of maybe the East and the West, these big categories that are foundationally about the politics of representation. And other books like Spivak's Subaltern, Can the Subaltern Speak? Or Steve Tanaka's Japan's Orient, they also build on this work. And they come up with really interesting examples of how Orientalism might manifest in Japan or in South Asia. But for me, when I think about Orientalism as the politics of representation, when I think about it historiographically in East Asian histories of science, what it looks like to me is this huge series. the series that maybe some of you might recognize, maybe not from the cover, but it is the Science and Civilization series in China. This began in the Second World War, and it's still ongoing with volumes that are coming out. And it's attributed to Joseph Needham, also known as Li Yue, and his longtime collaborator, Lu Guizhen, who I've written articles about. And this entire series is known for provoking or for inviting and offering the Needham question, Li Yue Nan Ti. And so the Needham question is, did the scientific revolution happen in China? And he's asking this, sometimes it's asked as, why didn't the scientific revolution happen in China? But for someone like Needham, this is an interesting question because the narrative of the scientific revolution is a narrative that begins in the 1930s. And for historians of science who work on histories of science, we have spent the rest of the 20th century writing about how the scientific revolution didn't happen. So it's interesting that for a lot of East Asianists, they're still fighting with this question, even though historically it wasn't a single event. But what it does do is that it perpetuates binaries and also perpetuates particular regimes of truth, because Needham is really surprised that the Chinese could invent anything at all. So for him, he's asking this question in order to locate histories of innovation. So histories of the compass, gunpowder, paper, it comes from this series. People are responding to this question to say, well, let's look at histories of invention. And that's why this is so important. But he's producing this entire volume with collaborators, and not all the collaborators buy into the Needham question. And so one of the collaborators is Francesca Bray, who, when she's quite young, she's not a grad student yet, but she contributes to writing volume 6.2 about biology and biological technology. It's really a history of agriculture. So she writes this book, and she gets a PhD retroactively from Cambridge for it. But she's really trained as an anthropologist. So she's reading people like Marcel Mauss. She's thinking about technology through the Francophone literature. She's thinking about technique. She's thinking about the body. And she writes one of the most important books on gender and technology in China that is called Technology and Gender, Fabrics of Power in Late Imperial China. And this is important where she writes about gendered spaces. She writes about weaving as a really important technical practice. And she's now that she's retired, is also editor of the Cambridge History of Technology volume. So she's still very active in the field, even though she's retired. But she also edited a book that has been foundational to my work, which is this book, Graphics and Text in the Production of Technical Knowledge in China, the Warp and the Weft. So she's interested in weaving, but she's also interested in images as technological objects. And specifically, she's interested in these old images, which are sometimes made of text that are used for divination. Sometimes they show weaving. Sometimes they're still used for these divinatory practices. But what's so interesting is that this graphic genre of a tu, it may look cartoonish, but it is incredibly old. There are these it's a very old kind of genre that now is used to refer to any kind of image. But historically, it's a particular genre that is not an object of fine art, and it's not a photography. It's not a likeness of something. It's not a hua, and it's not a xiang. As a tu, these are templates for action. They're meant to expand the imagination. They are cartoonish, but they're meant to expand the imagination. And they're also technical images. They're meant to invite a kind of action. And this is particularly important for me because when you look at invisible anatomy, they only ever live in the graphic genre of a tu, period. So again, these images that are described by hand that are showing paths in the body, channels in the body, they are not visible in full through MRI scans, CT scans, fluorescent dyes. You can't see them. They only ever exist in these hand-drawn images through the graphic genre of a tu. And this is a genre that does not exist in the European context. And you can talk about cartoons, but it's not a technical category that's so robust. So this gives rise to my book, Body Maps, Improvising Meridians and Nerves in Global Chinese Medicine. And here, I'm really interested in the persistence of these technical images that articulated these invisible anatomies, these objects of self that enacted different techniques of life. As I mentioned, this is really articulating what the body could do and what it did do. Just a little bit of background in terms of the literature. Michael mentioned that I did my PhD in history, anthropology, and science studies. Historians of science are obsessed with images. Critical cartographers are really interested in how maps lie. They're interested in symbolism. There's a whole book. Tim Ingold has written a whole book on lines. This book, Objectivity, is all about epistemologies of the eye, and comics are also really important. So this whole literature is quite robust in the European context, and I'm joining that with a lot of literature in East Asian medical practices, healing, thinking about the body. Although this particular book is not about healing, it's about the images. And the book itself is a response to a very basic question, where if you look at any practices with acupuncture, a lot of people tend to say that you're only needling at nerves. And I spent 15 years responding to that one question with this book. But just to say that if you are familiar with acupuncture, what's so interesting about this practice is that there's so much fixation on the metal needle inserting into the body, even though historically needles that were much thicker were made of bamboo or stone and different kinds of metals, including gold and silver. And acupuncture it's a compound practice. Zhenjiu acupuncture is used alongside moxa, which not that many people talk about, because moxa, this is a different kind of moxa cone, and there are different techniques for applying moxa. It operates on similar channels, but it's absorbed through the skin, through heat, or through the smoke. And it's used to treat lots of different things, including like nasal congestion, whooping cough, asthma, hypertension, gallstones, cholera, nosebleeds. If you have a nosebleed, I don't know how often people have nosebleeds in Quebec. Maybe it's a thing. The altitude, I don't know. Anyway, I'm not a doctor. Blood clotting, pediatric meningitis, maybe, okay. Facial nerve palsy. So it's a very very developed practice that spent a lot more time, has a longer history in Japan than it does in other parts of the world. But what is important is that the reason why I don't look at acupuncture, moxibustion, these kind of interventions on the skin, is because these paths that you see, these paths can be activated, as we know from in the case of subtle bodies, they're activated through herbs, they're activated internally, they're activated when you meditate, when you practice Qigong. So the points are not just points for these external objects of manipulation, they're paths that are much more dynamic, which gives rise to this book. And so I'll spend the rest of my talk just talking about the book cover. I mean, yes, please judge a book by its cover, but I'll just take apart the primary sources that really, I think, offer the thrust, the main message of the book. And it is also open access, so you don't have to buy it. There's also a discount code on my website, which I'll show you later, bodymaps-book.com. Anyway, so the book is, here you can see that's really about comparing this history, this entangled history of representing nerves and meridians. And part of the book is arguing that these physiologists, throughout 10 centuries, these physiologists expressed anatomy in these graphic genres including a tool. And they debated what these invisible structures could do based on where they appeared on the page. These arguments are always happening on the paper, even though they knew that the body was so much more dynamic. And in doing so, what you see is that mapping meridians and nerves, or meridians as nerves, it underestimated the practical role of graphic forms. This is why at the conference I was just like, what are the images doing? So anyway, so it's really important, like different graphic forms demands different forms of reading, different forms of imagination, and graphic forms like literary genres. I was really inspired by literary studies, because it helped me think about genre that manifested what Wittgenstein has called life forms. So ideological stereotypes, generic types, like these are types that allow us to imagine like models, like heuristics for the world that organize forms of social action. But here, when I think about life form and social action, here I'm thinking about life forms as cosmologies, but not cosmology in the sense of like the universe, but cosmology as this very articulated network of causal relationships. Why would you want to activate this path? What does it actually do? Sage is training to be naturopath. Like why do certain compounds allow for healing? I think and also time of day, that's part of this causal relationship. And they also operate at different scales, from the page to the body to the sky. And also I'm thinking about social action through modes of improvisation. And this is from some of my colleagues' work, Andrew Goldman, who was really interested in the neuroscience of improvisation and improvisation as a way of knowing. And I borrowed this from him to think about how all these images are, again, drawn by hand. And because they're drawn by hand, these handmade inscriptions, again, on paper, woodblock, on copper plate, they required abundant flourishes to invoke complex cosmological objects. And specifically what I mean here is that you can see this kind of improvisation more readily, not necessarily in the images of meridians, but the images of nerves. So how are nerves improvised? How are these images improvised? So this image here comes from a 1951 lithograph illustrated by a young physician, Wang Xuetai. And he is kind of I was going to say kidnapped, but no, he's not kidnapped. He was invited to contribute to a textbook, an anatomical textbook. But here he's illustrating what he describes as 11 pairs of intercostal nerves. So intercostal, inter means between, costal means ribs. So he's trying to illustrate nerves at the periphery of the body. And I've spent some time, like most of my work in my postdoc, half of it was teaching, researching in history of science. The other half I spent time in touch labs, mitochondrial psychobiology labs, and also working on chemotherapy-induced peripheral neuropathy. So I'm interested in the non-CNS part, but intercostal nerves. Intercostal nerves are interesting because in this period in the 20th century, they appear inconsistently, either as 11 pairs, 12 pairs, 30 pairs. And the history of intercostal nerves that Wang is contributing to is one that involves a lot of flourishing. So one of the earliest images of intercostal nerves comes from 1663, Thomas Willis, who was illustrating these branches, and he is drawing them on the paper, on the page. And he is an anatomist, he is making dissections, but he cannot actually see this in the body. But intercostal nerves are really important to him in the 17th century because it allows him to think about where human rationality lives. Where do the human emotions live? They don't necessarily live in the brain, and he's thinking about the brain as an object for the human soul that makes them different from animals. The animal spirits can move through here too, but there is a kind of rationality and emotion that sits here. And this is all incredibly, detailed. And this image gets copied over and over again. And so in 1678, Aimé Bourdon, another French anatomist, he also reproduces Willis's image of intercostal nerves. But this time, he adds a bunch of names. And when he names it, he gives it a distinct ontological character signature. He uses music notations, he uses astrological signs, he uses different letters, and he also offers a more detailed description of what these different branches are, these improvised branches that Willis had produced on the page. And so this image also gets reproduced. I mean, we see versions of this in reproductions of Vesalius, but Vesalius is a little bit earlier. This is just to say that when it comes to nerves, natural philosophers in the early modern period are making non-empirical leaps to join nervous anatomy with nervous expressions, emotions, rationality, nervous anatomy as this deeply improvised practice that you see on the page. And nervous anatomy then came to stand in as an empirical basis for explaining all forms of human emotion, thought, and sensation, even though it wasn't, again, empirically grounded. It is an act of improvising as a way of knowing. And at the same time, nerves, even though they come to stand in for all expressions of human emotion, rationality, they're still unstable and unreliable as an object of modernity because they're black boxed. And what's interesting is that, this language of nerves becomes increasingly fixed, especially the language of neuroanatomy becomes increasingly fixed in the 20th century, even though it continues to be very poorly articulated. A number of neurophysiologists, they recognize how sensations on the surface of the skin, they don't map on to the structures beneath them. So they're trying to say one set of nerves can produce or register light touch or pain or, heat. And yet those structures don't map on to what people sense. And this is another chapter in the book. And also nerves are used to explain away other structures like meridians, but it can't. And one of the reasons why I bring this up is because meridians are also something different. And they also exist in different graphic genre. So I'll turn to now the images of meridian. So this image it's around the 1930s and is associated with Chang Da-en, who is a really important reformer. He's trained, he's based in Shanghai, is trained in Tokyo for acupuncture maxibustion. And he is fascinated with these points, with these images, because in China, the libraries no longer have the images that he needs. And so when he goes to Tokyo, he sees that there are a number of images, including these full body images of, the technical term for these images are Mingtang Tu, like these full body images of meridian paths. And he starts to study them. And it's like there's a story where the first time he sees a full set of meridians, he starts crying because he's like, oh my God, like I didn't know that they actually existed still. And he also understands that these paths are, this is also part of some images that he reproduced from a 14th century text, Shi Si Jing Fa Hui, the 14th treatise of 14 meridians. So he's reproducing the 14th century text with images of bodies that have their shoes removed, they're lifting their robes, and they're the single paths that move from the head to the feet to the chest to the through the legs to the arms, and they come as discrete paths, 14 paths, and he reproduces each one of these from a Japanese text, and you can see they're mostly male, and they also show a range of Confucian scholars. Sometimes they show Manchu officials, so the bodies change over time, and it's the images of these paths that I call meridians. So meridians represent channels in the body. They're not ontologically telling you what they are, but they're representing objects that are called jingluo and jingmai. And they're even smaller paths, jingluo, jingmai. We can say more about this later. The word jing actually refers to weaving. So it's extending from the body. It's the same word as the warp in a loom. And so meridians in the book, I'm using meridians as a metaphorical term to describe graphic representations of Jingluo and Jingmai. It's just what happens on the page, because sinologists will be like, this is not a right translation. And I'm like, this is not a translation. This is a way I'm approaching the images. And so what I'm saying is that these graphic genres, these graphic objects, they're relaying both the materiality and the invisibility of corporeal structures that shapes discussions of ontology and location. And this question of invisibility it comes up in the 1970s, where people are like, well, if it's invisible, it can't be material. But if you talk about things like qi, it's both invisible and material. Same thing, there are lots of things that are both invisible and material, but for some reason, when it comes to Asian structures, it's a problem. Meridians, what's so interesting about meridians is that they represent elastic objects, and they're measured in flexible units of distance that are animating, expressing, and composing life. So these are elastic objects, and you'll see in a minute what I mean by that. Before I get into a close reading of one of these images that'll involve everybody in the room, I'd like to also just give us some groundwork, which is to say that when Chung is engaging with these images, he's engaging with the body cartographically. So this is also part of the same set of images, but these bodies are facing up and facing down. So you have an aerial view of them. But they also tell you that they also give you discrete measurements where they say that the distance between the ears is 1 foot 3 inches, distance between the cheek is 7 inches, but then on the arms, it'll tell you people range in size, so take measurements according to the body. Long and short inches vary from infants to the elderly. And so what he's using is that he's describing this unit of a twin, which most people just translate as an inch, but it's really the middle metatarsal of your middle finger. It's this inside distance. And the twin, often it's described as the same body inch, but it's stabilized around the 7th century and historically used to refer to the size of a millet seed. And early mathematics would use twin to describe the distance between the earth to the sun. So it had different material references, but in this case, it's usually referencing this. And Chang Da-en in the 1930s is copying text like this. People still copy text and images like this. So a twin is part of a larger set of other kinds of measurements, units of measurements. We'll say maybe it's an inch, it's actually bigger than an inch. I grew up with a twin ruler, which was kind of fat, and I got all of my math homework wrong because it was like a 10 twin ruler. Anyway, so let's call it an inch for now, even though it's not really an inch. But 10 twin add up to a shi. And let's say maybe it's a foot, but obviously you can hear there's like a kind of metric. There's something metric-y going on. And then 10 shi adds up to a zhang. Let's call that maybe a megameter. But I kind of if you want some reference, this is like maybe this is a twin. And then I'm trying to see, is this this is a maybe a chi. And then here we have a zhang, like much longer. So you have these different units, maybe an inch, maybe a foot, maybe a megameter. But the most important thing is that they're all flexible. Oh, someone raised their hand. I don't know but the most important thing is that they're all flexible. And this is to say that practitioners and illustrators, they understood that units of distance were both relative and they're discrete. And again, they're both relative and they're discrete. And they're reproducing early modern sources that represented the body as a cartographic and cosmologically embedded object. So modern illustrators are engaging with earlier texts, and they're also reading texts that look a little bit like this. This is not a typical image that you would see in some of these books on meridians. But this particular image is dated to around the early 13th century, and it's associated with a practitioner named Wang Haogu. And Wang Haogu, he's interesting because he's writing this book in a period of imperial collapse. So it's the fall of the Jin Empire. You have the Jurchens coming in, and also in the 13th century, there's a record of like 30 epidemics compared to one epidemic in the 12th century. So he's looking around to him, people are dying, people are fleeing, and the physicians seem to be useless. They're like, COVID, like you're so useless, you don't know what's going on. And for him, he says that the reason why physicians are so lacking is because they don't understand the ancient texts. And he gives himself this name Wang Haogu, lover of antiquity. So he's trying to think about, in the 13th century, he's thinking about the ancients even then. So this image is actually quite hard to read. There are Taoist trigrams on there. You have two eyes at the top, mu, that later get, this is a Japanese hand copied manuscript, so I don't know the date of this particular copy, but sometimes the eyes turn into sun and moon. We also see feet down here, so right over here. But this image is hard to read, so we're not going to focus on the image, but the text surrounding it, because Tool is all about, it's animated by the surrounding text. And it will tell you very, very basic, super stereotypical, very common text saying that the paths are moving from the hands to the feet to the chest to the stomach, and it's a natural correlation among heaven and earth. But then it continues on and it gives you these very discrete measurements. So all of these paths are measured discretely, and it measures them in units of twin, maybe an inch, units of shi, maybe a foot, and units of zhang, maybe a megameter. So they're very discrete. And they're in these yin paths, you have yang paths. You also have qiao meridians, which move from the eyes to the feet. And my favorite meridian pair, ren mai du mai, which is circling the body. And so to read this actual set, this is where we get interactive, because I've mapped them out for you so you can see how long they are. So do you want to be the head?
Sure.
Okay, Jonathan, what's in here? So I've mapped these out. They're also color coded. So if you want, yeah. I'll need people to maybe, if you want to get up, that way I'll need people to hold parts of things. So, all right. So this first line says 3 yang hand meridians. I'm just going to use the Chinese. I can't do the, okay. Are 5尺3丈5尺 each, 3丈 total. So these are the yang hand meridians. If we want to hold this here, just don't pull too hard. This is the yang hand meridians. They're a darker pink because they're going to be different from the 3 yin hand meridians that are 3尺5寸 each, 2丈1尺 total. So it tells you each and total. So you have to reach in here. So you're holding my hands. Okay, cool, great. If someone else wants to come up and assist, if you want to hold, this is the yang hands. And Nathan, if you want to get the other.
Are we
yang
gonna
hands.
feel the energy flow once we
I
get
don't know, it depends what Michael's doing. I don't know what Michael's doing. What's he doing? I don't know. And then the feet. Okay, let's go for the yang feet. These are going to be the feet. So they are 8尺 each, 4丈8尺 total. These are yin feet. So you can see the yang, I've moved darker, yin are lighter. So no one wants to hold this edge. You want to go on that side. or someone can come up with this. Thank you so much.
Setting the bar high for future participation.
Yeah.
Then we have the qiao in green. These are, I've never really, I haven't encountered these before, but the qiao mai are green from the eyes to the feet. And then my favorite, 任脉动脉4尺5寸 total, each 9指 total. So someone this, I don't know what we can know this. So okay, so here we have the hands. Here we have it, and then here's the torso. So for those holding any of the pads, like what do you notice about what do you notice? What do you like? What do you feeling things, or what do you notice about the pairings? We have yang, yin, yang. Wait, no, yin, yang.
Some have like a parallel partner and some don't, which is strange to me. I don't know if that's-
So the yin and yang pairs, they're so interesting because the yin pads are described as being deeper in the body, these lighter ones. And if you get sick or as you age, sometimes these are harder and harder to feel, harder and harder to palpate. There's depth. You also notice that the ones that are paired are 3 each. And they do have, like, these pairs are pretty set, the yin and yang. So for instance, the spleen, they're also associated with individual organs. So the spleen, we'll see in a minute, but the spleen is yin and the stomach is yang, and they're paired together. They also pair on the wrist. But you also notice that the yin pads are shorter than the yang pad. The yang are quite long. But this is all based on my twin, my body inch. So they're much longer than me. And so practitioners know, and even at the hands, this is meant to meet at the wrist. So they twist, these pads are meant to twist, they rise, they sink. If it's a hot day, like we're indoors, I'm still sweating. It's like, if it's indoors, then you don't have to needle. If you're, then they're closer to the surface of the skin. If it's colder, they're much deeper. And so just stay there, because another reason why these are important. So you've all noticed that, some are paired, some are not paired, which might suggest a different genealogy of pads for sure. That does exist. Sometimes historically they move from 9 pairs to 10 pairs to 11 pairs. Now it's 12 main pairs, and then this plus this is 14. See, I don't know what's going on with the shell, but I guess somebody can tell me.
It's very long.
They're very long.
Does it
They break
curve
the body.
back in the body?
They
'Cause
curve
it's
back.
even longer.
They jump
than
the body.
itself.
It's longer than the body. They curve, they twist, they sink. And some people might say that for acupuncturists, these pads are also meant to extend beyond the body, and that you can feel someone else's energy through the pads emanate, because they don't just stay corporeally. Were you ready to say something, Sage? Oh, okay. But if you hold on to this, so one thing is that this text goes on. It tells you that all of these pads, you notice that they're discrete. It tells you how long they are individually and how long they are together, because all of these numbers matter. So I'm going to say a lot of numbers. I just said a bunch of numbers, but the only numbers that you really have to remember is like 9, 12, 9 and 12, 3, 9 and 12. Those are important numbers. But anyway, I'm going to say a bunch more numbers. So all of these pads, the thing is that they add up. So this is a mini thing. I don't know if we should take a selfie. Real quick. And then stay right there. Okay. Stay right there. And maybe we can do it like this. Oh, do I have your consent? I will not leave. Okay. Okay, cool. And then I can do the selfie here. Oh, okay. Here we go. Yay. Okay.
That's
super.
great.
So I'll send it. And maybe I can, so all these pads, the most important thing is that they all add up. And I think this would be a better
And this is scaled to your body specifically. Okay, interesting.
We can see what it's like when someone else wants to. So if you want to put them down, you can. If you enjoy holding them, feel free. But you can put them down. But then, Michael, you can stay there.
Yeah.
All these pads, if you want to put them down, all these pads add up. They all actually combine. I've shown them here as being discrete, but these pads add up. So if you'll now hold this, again, same colors. And they add up to 16丈2尺. So all of these add up to 1,620 spin. And this is actually a really important number just to remember. And then this text continues to say every cycle one cycle every 2 steps, 克, results in 50 cycles. You can put this down. And then 13,500, also another important number, 13,500 breaths makes a living person. You can sit if you want.
I just don't want to block.
Oh, it's
the-
okay, okay, maybe, yeah.
For the
Um,
minors.
oh, okay, no worries, I can hold this then.
Yeah,
And
I
you-
mean, I think here.
Oh, here's good?
if it's
Okay.
helpful.
So again, these lengths add up to 1,620 twin. One cycle every 2 steps results in 50 cycles. 13,500 breaths makes a living person based on images of water clocks. So this, I was like, well, I don't know what's going on. So basically, units of distance are also units of time, right? Units of distance are units of time. Units of time are units of life. And these are all discrete because 13,500 breaths. What this means is that this actually references an earlier text that tells you that when you breathe, you move the mai. When you breathe, you both create and you move each path. So exhaling moves the mai, the qi travels 3 twin, 10 twin. Inhaling moves the mai, and the qi travels 3 twin. A steady inhale and exhale, single breath, the qi travels 6 twin. So breaths are units of life. I mentioned earlier that we're looking at units of life. And this number, 13,500, is interesting because if you do the math, which I did do, but I had help, 6 twin is 1 breath, 1 inhale, exhale. 1,620 twin divided by 6 twin is 270 breaths, inhale, exhale. 270 times 50 cycles is 13,500 breaths. So these numbers are not arbitrary. And it also, this is Lan's math. My mom helped because she's very helpful. Also it tells you that based on images of water clocks, this is interesting because water clocks, this is an 18th century image, it's not from the 13th century, but water clocks that would drip water to tell time, they would end in this final bucket that had a ruler floating in it, and the ruler was divided into 100 parts, 100 steps. So a single day was divided into 100 parts, and 1 ke is maybe 15 minutes. And even now in Chinese, if you say, I'm going to start at 4:15, you say, you talk about hours as ke, 一刻钟. Maybe it's 15 minutes, but ke, I'm translating as steps because I don't want to be anachronistic here. But it's interesting because the 2 steps, let's see, what happened after this? Maybe it's around 30 minutes per breath. So 15 minutes to draw in, let's say, 一刻 or 2刻, and then to push out. So it's 30 minutes. And Wang Honggu, he looks at this and he's looking at the stagnation. That's, oh, you can sit
Yeah,
there,
maybe.
right here. Sorry. Thank you. So he looks at all of this. He knows that this is a single unit. And he's looking at everybody dying around him and he says, hang on, maybe it takes longer for us to breathe in and breathe out because it's 1 hour per breath. Maybe our bodies are getting more stagnant because of all the pandemics that are happening. So this doesn't change the math. 4 steps doesn't change the math. But this is just to say that when you have an image like this, that's talking about all of these paths and these paths adding up to a single unit, we can see that close reading meridian tool, it reveals specific kinds of accuracy, and they're featuring discrete lengths that are made of flexible units that are tethered to fixed quantities of time, the water clocks, fixed quantities of time. And what's also interesting is that these quantities of distance and breadth, they may have had numerological purpose, meaning and implication. I mentioned lots of numbers, 1,620 twin is the length of meridians, and 30,500 breaths. What's interesting is that these numbers, if you add them up individually, they all add up to 9. And the number of points, the number of meridian sites on the body, it's stable for about 2 centuries. It's always 360 sites, kneeling sites, moxa sites, meditation sites, and 3 + 6 is 9. So it's not a surprise because 9 is also the homophone for longevity. So this appears a lot. It's just like, is it a coincidence? I don't know. Like it's again they're not arbitrary, which is the point. And so meridian tool, these images are technological objects that are used to measure other technological objects, 经络 and 经脉, that are moving life and they're making life. And if you knew how, you could extend life through moving and making in breath. And this matters a lot. This matters because of how meridians are represented even now. So this image of meridians, it comes again, it comes from the 1950s, from the same illustrator we saw earlier who illustrated lithography of nerves. But this is a few years later, he creates meridians and he draws them in red, and they're no longer nerves. They're no longer the same color as nerves. This is in 1954 in Wangxue. As he ages throughout his whole career, he's thinking about meridians as a single unit. So in 1966, in the middle of the Cultural Revolution, he is obsessed with these paths. They're not fragmented in the body, but they connect with each other as a single unit. They move from yin to yang, from the hands to the feet. They connect yin organs like the spleen with yang organs like the stomach. And they are, again, a single unit. And I've color coded them a little bit differently. I mean, still yin is lighter than yang. So these yin yang pairs, these are only 12 pairs. These are just the hands and the feet. You don't see the yellow and the green. But this is the 1966 image that he produced. And he continues to fixate on this single unit of life because he knows that they're more than just for needling and for heating. And he continues to think about this even as he ages. He dies in 2008. And he is actually involved in the WHO's standardization of acupuncture maximum points. But as he's doing that, he's still obsessed with images. And so he edits this manual of Chinese moxa and acupuncture maximum. And he invites someone to open up this whole book with units of life, calendars, Taoist trigrams, 5 phases, cosmology. The constellations are really important. I can say more about that, but he creates a whole circle of these different units of time to then offer an updated version of his meridian wheel as a single unit of life. And so this is just to say that when you look at the book cover, hopefully you'll carry this with you, this talk with you, but it's to say that the grasping the discursive, political, and ontological stakes of body maps requires multiple methodological approaches: math, reconstruction, art history, critical cartography, metaanthropology, to wrestle with invisible structures as dynamic technological objects. Remember, these paths, they stretch, they can grow, and they can shrink. And interrogating meridians and nerves through the graphic genres further demonstrates why and how they have failed to meet. So this is my response to when someone says, we're just needling out nerves, and I spent 15 years responding to this through the form of a book. So that is this book. And just to wrap up, I mentioned that this book is not about healing, but a lot of the film work that I do focuses on practitioners. And I'm thinking about a second book project. Maybe it's a film series called Silver and Smoke. And it's focusing on feminist histories, material histories of modern Asian medicine. But I'm trying to think about not just technologies of life, but technologies of divination. So thinking about when someone dies, or when someone is going to get better, when is someone going to get sick. These are all technologies of divination. When am I going to heal? When am I going to get better? When am I going to get sick? But also, when is the nation going to modernize? When are people going to finally accept transcultural psychiatry? When? The when of it all. And so I'm trying to, how long? But I'm thinking about it like, maybe we can tell the story through different kinds of objects. Like this is an ear model. It's, I don't know if you've heard of auricular acupuncture with ear seeds, but this is famous because it's not actually Chinese, but it's developed in France and then imported into China. And then it's framed as a traditional Chinese practice. And even here, this ear has Chinese inscriptions on it. But maybe, yeah, how can engaging with a broad assembly of objects expand discourses of what is possible? Because I'm interested in this ear, not because of its pedagogical value, but because of where it's sat. So it spent a lot of time in the pocket of a teenager who was working in the countryside, writing music to think, when am I going to leave? When am I going to be free? And it symbolizes an object of hope in a time of hopelessness. So I'm thinking about it. This is the instrument that she used to compose on. So maybe I'm trying to reframe practices that are secular, orientalist, esoteric, contradictory, and cosmological, and really thinking about, in addition to objects like this, a wheel like this, it's also used to tell time. And you have calendars like this that were used by practitioners in the 70s that then moved from China to Paris. And they have a whole clinic on, it's a whole like transmodal acupuncture something that is meant to predict what kinds, or to measure what kinds of points to needle when you have long COVID, or if you have adverse reactions to vaccines. But the needles that they use, depending on the time of day, is made of gold or silver. So there's, again, more cosmological considerations here. And this is just to using objects to shift our scope of inquiry. So that's really it. How we might consider techniques of self to reframe technologies of life. And thank you. And if you want to, this is the website for the book. There's a discount code for 30% if you want the physical copy, but when it's released in April, it's also open access. So I'm going to put more resources on here. There's all the images are available on the website. I have a short video introducing the book, and hopefully it's a good resource for people who might be interested.